Again, it's my honor to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and have these kind of dialogues. And I encourage you, if you've got questions, to reach out and we'd be happy to discuss it further. Tonight's question is, can a Christian believe in evolution? Now, this is a challenging topic, especially for a lawyer who's a lawyer primarily because he could not pass the science courses. But one of the challenges of this question is it assumes that you're in an environment where it's relevant, right? I mean, we don't live day to day with any relevance for whether or not evolution is true. But in the academic setting, in a school setting, it's clearly part of a worldview that children and high school students and even college students and grad students are being indoctrinated in. And so I think it is relevant in the sense that it shapes the most core values and thoughts about reality. And that those thoughts, those ideas about reality are going to in turn affect everything you do and live and how you live in life. And so I do think it's a good question to answer. I teach at a small Christian university, Freed-Hardeman University in Tennessee, and a lot of times I hear people refer to it as the bubble, right? And by that they mean it's this small campus with less than 2,000 people that is, everybody all thinks the same. Now, of course, that's not true. And yet, that's the perception. Maybe it's because there is a critical mass of Christians on that campus that do share the same worldview, and that allows them to accomplish things as a group that we can't accomplish individually by ourselves, and they become quite a force for good. But that said, there is a lot of things that the faculty will disagree on, or even the students. And so I think that it's important that we recognize that every teacher, even a science teacher, a biology teacher, is going to have a point of view, and that's to be expected. And we should also expect that we're not all going to agree on that particular topic or that particular point of view. And there's no getting around that fact that we have different opinions about what the facts are. But the issue, and I mentioned this in our Q&A after the first session, the issue is not whether folks have different opinions, but how they express those opinions. And I think it's important that we approach this topic tonight with the right attitude, the right intention, and that is to maybe not try to win the argument tonight one way or the other on this question, but to just plant some seeds and allow God to give the increase. I would analogize it to, as a lawyer, maybe me presenting to you some evidence and allow you as the jury to reach a reasonable conclusion. So, biology professors around the country are kind of notorious for dismissing out of hand the idea of creationism. They will basically start off a class for freshman biology class, and they'll throw the Bible in the trash can, and they'll make some offensive statement about how anybody dumb enough to actually believe in the first couple of chapters of that book really don't need to be in this class. Well, how do you respond to that? Are you intimidated? Do you feel like, he must know more than I do? Is there really a place for a Christian in a science class? And can reasonable people disagree about the truth or the reality of this? Now, I again would encourage you to basically judge for yourself whether it's reasonable for a Christian to believe in evolution. But the first thing I've got to do, skip that. The first thing I've got to do is sort of define our terms, defining evolution. Because I think this is critical, because I think part of the reason why people will immediately turn off a Christian who's trying to have a reasonable discussion about this is that we haven't defined our terms. When you use the word evolution, if you mean change over time, that's not an issue. Both Christians and non-Christians believe that we change over time. You just have to look at my son to see how much taller he is than me to know that that's true based on your environment and climate and so forth. If you are talking about microevolution, again, change within a species that is going to make differences, significant differences, not just in color but in function. That again, not much disagreement there. I think both Christians and non-Christians agree that microevolution exists. What we are wanting to talk about tonight, the harder question, is whether or not a Christian can believe or should believe in macroevolution. And macroevolution is the idea that you go from molecules to humans, right? And that you do that by accident. You don't do it with any kind of intelligent being orchestrating or designing that. That is macroevolution, Darwinian evolution, if you will. And I not only think that the evidence is against, that there's not enough evidence to support macroevolution, I think there's a lot of evidence against it, making it an unreasonable, untenable position to take. So let me offer three points to think about and see what you think. And the first point is, I don't think a Christian should believe in macroevolution because only God actually creates. Let me explain what I mean by that. Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Now, do you really understand what that means? He is not taking different materials out of the storage lockers and mixing ingredients like baking a cake. He is literally creating something from nothing. When you talk about creation, it's something only God can do. And so when we start engaging people or debating people over the question of evolution, we need to make clear in our minds and in that discussion that evolution has nothing to do with creation. Evolution is a secondary step, and that the concept of creation is the concept, something that only a God, like the God that we read in the Bible, can do, because it requires you to create something from nothing. Evolution assumes something and then changes it over time. And that's a fundamental difference. I love Ecclesiastes chapter 1 verse 9, because it says, what has been is what will be. And what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. You've heard that, right? Now listen to the next verse. Verse 10. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It's a rhetorical question. The answer is no. It has been already in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of the former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who come after. You know, if you've seen some of the 7 wonders of the world, that list changes over time because people have forgotten what were one of the top wonders of the world. It's covered over in grass and moss and destroyed by the elements and erosion. And yet, even when we still can see something like the pyramids, we don't know who built them. We don't even really know how. We admire them, but a lot of that knowledge and understanding of what was accomplished has gone by the wayside. But all of that was not creating. When you built the pyramids, you were taking materials that already existed and just putting them in a different form, in the shape of a pyramid, if you will. Now, so what I would ask is for you to think about when I am trying to question how evolution occurs, I need to understand that it occurs at a much lower level than what God did when He created all things. We're just recombining. Likewise, evolution is just recombining, and it's God that does the real creating. Think about taking the color blue and the color yellow, and when you combine them, you make green, but it's nothing new. Or take the next slide, this Apple Watch, and it's an amazing invention. I've really enjoyed mine, right? And it took a lot of engineering to put all of that into this little package. But at the end of the day, you may invent a watch, but you didn't create time. Next slide. Even bringing a new life into this world. We think of that as a creative act, right? But really all you're doing is you're taking a man's genes and a woman's genes and you're mixing them together. God is doing the creating. You are merely bringing those different elements together. If you call that human creation, creating humans, as a human act, then you would also call baking a cake, or me putting sugar in my tea and inserting it together, making that tea, that would be a creative act, which obviously it isn't. Next slide. So the first point is very simply, when we talk about evolution, we got to distinguish that from creation. And that ultimately, if you really want to explain this world and have a clear worldview, you still need creation in order to explain it. Evolution won't do that for you. The second point is that I don't believe that what we call macroevolution is compatible with the Bible. And there's a few reasons why I think this is true. Genesis chapter 2, verse 5 is probably a good place to start. And I'm going to start up in verse 5, even though really the point I want you to see is in verse 7. But it says, when no bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up. So imagine like one of those sci-fi movies where you're seeing the terra of Mars, right? That just dirt and it's without any kind of form. It's got all these bumps and everything, but it has no plants, no living plants. That's what's being described here. It's a blank slate, if you will. And it says, and a mist was going up from the land and was watering the whole face of the ground. Then, verse 7 says, the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living creature. Now I want you to observe that although we're at day 6 and there are many animals that God has already created, it doesn't say that man came from an animal. It says man came from dust. And the idea is that God could have explained himself if in fact he took, whether over a 24-hour period or over millions and billions of years, man from some lower life form. After all, that's how Eve was created. Not that men are lower life forms, but that God explained that he took from Adam a rib. So he took from an existing life form and created another life form, the woman, right? And so God was fully capable of explaining himself in that way, and he chose not to because that's not how man was created. Man was created from inorganic material. He was created from dirt, from dust. Now, that said, evolution is not compatible with this, is my point. Macroevolution is not compatible with this verse. And that only matters, of course, if you respect the authority of Scripture, if you believe in the inerrancy of the Bible. If you don't, then this probably won't be that compelling of an argument. But the question is not whether anybody should be believing in macroevolution. The question is whether a Christian should believe in macroevolution. And a Christian needs to believe in the authority of Scripture, the inerrancy of Scripture. And there's no way, in my opinion, for you to reconcile this verse with the concept of macroevolution to explain how Adam was created. And so God, I think clearly in Genesis 1 and 2, shows that God created life forms individually through the days, and then you get man on day 6, and he does it directly from dust. It's not a reasonable interpretation to say that the text could allow you to fit macroevolution in there. Last point, number 3, it doesn't... macroevolution doesn't, not only in point number 1, we were trying to make the point, is macroevolution doesn't doesn't get you to a worldview that makes sense, because you need to still explain where whatever they used to create the other forms came from, so you still need God. But the third point is that macroevolution doesn't get around the need for God with regard to its own process assumptions. Now, let me give you a few examples of this. My father-in-law, for many, many years, when I first started dating Jennifer, my wife, and first got married, he was really big into beagles. He took them to field trials, and he would have dozens of them, right? And he would win a lot of awards for his beagles. And what he would do is he would breed them very carefully, right? So they would stay on the line, so a rabbit could run and zigzag around a field, and I would see the rabbit run right in front of them. And these dumb dogs refused to go after the rabbit. They would stay on the scent, because the way they were bred, if they went ahead and did the logical thing, if you're trying to catch a rabbit and jump off that scent and get to the rabbit, they would have lost the field trial. And so they would follow the little zigzag trail and then eventually get to that same path where I saw the rabbit 15 minutes ago. And so I got a little frustrated because, you know, if you're going to chase rabbits, it's to hunt them, right? And that wasn't the purpose for his dogs and why he loved the activity so much. But he bred the dogs to have that good nose and that good form and that ability to bark and not be too loud, not too soft. And there was a lot of different characteristics he was looking for in those dogs. And he would breed dogs that had a stronger mouth in order to bring it out in the pups from a female that had a little softer mouth, et cetera, et cetera. And the first point I want you to understand about why macroevolution is not going to be able to accomplish what people think it will without God is my beagles. Go to the next slide. This one here. One of the things that scientists have recognized is there's something called epigenetics that are basically the structure, okay? And that the structure in which your DNA, which can be manipulated and can have mutations and can change the way you appear and whatnot, is like a ceiling on how much it can change. And the only way, so I can change those dogs, I can change their color, I can change their size, I can change their loudness, I can change their smell, right? By manipulating the DNA, either intentionally or even accidentally, you give me enough time, right? Mutations. But what you cannot do, and people are just now realizing it, is allow that change to surpass the epigenetic code that or structure that will limit that ability to change. And so consequently, you're never, no matter how much change you're talking about, you're never going to get a cat out of those beagles. You with me? Because their epigenetic centers are not going, structures are not going to allow that possibility to occur. So you are going to be limited to your various types of body plans. Now, that said, one of the challenges is, a second challenge is, go to the next slide, is something that you can read about in a book called Darwin's Doubt by Stephen Meyer. It's a big book, and it's something I would recommend to you if you're interested in this subject, but it's a simple concept. And the concept is that you cannot you can modify DNA to a certain extent, but you cannot modify the structure of a cell because of this thing called epigenetic information. Now, next slide. See this bird? There is a second argument that I would use to sort of say that macroevolution is not going to get you anywhere without an intelligent designer. And that is that if this bird was slowly over time gradually evolving to be able to fly, it would never get off the ground if it only had half a wing or even 90% of those feathers. You have to have the full package in order for flight to be possible. So if you're saying that flight evolved from a fish to a bird over gradual time, I would submit to you that every one of those would have been failures until you had a full 100% bird. Let me make it the point a little differently. Look at the next slide. Here's how Frank Turek, who is a pretty well-known apologist, and he puts it this way: the longer period of time you have, the more nature randomizes things. So let me show you something that most of us have, which is a smartphone. And I want you to think about this phone from the second argument for why macroevolution is not enough without God, and that is it's called irreducibility, right? The idea that some things are so complex, so irreducibly complex, that you cannot, they wouldn't survive in a evolutionary sense of survival of the fittest because they'd have no function, they'd serve no purpose if they were only partially done. Let me give you an example. This is a breakdown of this iPhone and all of the ingredients that are involved. Copper, gold, silver, tungsten, right? Silicone, phosphorus, boron, right? Arsenic. And you've got to have all of those ingredients in order to make this phone. Next slide. If you break it down, they total up to 129 grams. If I was to take this phone and crush it down to its molecule, this is what you would get, 129 grams of these different ingredients. So what are the chances, without any intelligent design, just by chance, and I'll give you as much time as you want, if I was to drop this phone from a plane at 1,000 feet, not this phone, if I was to drop those ingredients from a plane at 1,000 feet, that when that landed by chance, this phone would be formed? Everybody'd say, no chance. Well, I'll give you more time. So let's go up to 60,000 feet. Now, what's the chance if I was to drop 129 grams of exactly the right amounts, of exactly the right ingredients, or maybe even an oversupply if you need some chance of things, washing away or blowing away. If I drop it from outer space, would you still, with enough unlimited time, ever get this iPhone? And the answer, of course, is no. Why? Because of irreducible complexity. You see, that we're not talking about an intelligent being. I've heard the analogy when you make these kind of teleological arguments of a monkey on a typewriter and how long would it take for a monkey to accidentally create a Shakespeare play, right? I'm not willing to, that's not a fair analogy, because the monkey's a living being. He can affect change. He can apply energy and take materials and mix them and do things, right? To get evolution, you got to get evolution before life. That means you got to get evolution. You got to get these things to do something and mix up and create something without any life form yet. It's not possible. If you have inorganic material like 129 grams of these items, right, then nature, the second law of thermodynamics, says that those things are going to erode and dissipate and scatter. They're not going to come together in some kind of organized, useful form. 100% of the time, that's the case. If you have some source of energy, if you have some sort of life form, then you might be able to make progress, but you can't get to life with just macroevolution because of irreducible complexity. Third and last point. Now this one is probably over my depth, and this one I found very interesting, and so I just want to share it with you because it's basically an example of the third kind of argument, and that is the fine-tuning of the universe. The idea is that as the more we learn in science about this universe, the more we need God to explain it. I'm fascinated by things that I cannot see, like electrons. And the fact that everything is made up of things that at this level that they're so small you can't even see them, right? That's a fascinating idea, right? But what scientists are learning about these electrons is that they're in all these different orbits, right? Even in one molecule, they've got these electrons in orbits. And the reality is, what's keeping these electrons from falling down to a lower orbit? And the answer is nothing. There is a principle, a law that happened to exist that says there can be no more than 2 electrons in any given orbit. But for that law, that principle, it would be impossible for us to have any solidity. For you and me to be here in a physical form, walking around, sitting in a chair, everything would just collapse. But for one very precise, very simple rule. And there are actually a dozen more rules like that are required for you to have life as we know it. And yet those rules would have had to be require such precision and they have to be so fine-tuned that that even atheists like Richard Dawkins or Stephen Hawking will clearly admit that there is a fine-tuning of this universe that cannot be explained, that even the smartest and brightest physicists and scientists that we know with our intelligence could not forecast or create. Now, next slide. One of the other things I'm fascinated at the other end is dark energy, right? It's like 97% of this universe. And what you may or may not realize about this dark energy is that it too requires a very precise amount, a calculation that has to be at roughly 0 in order for dark energy to not collapse on itself and thereby destroy the universe. If you were to adjust the precise, exact amount of gravitational force or the constant for dark energy, even the slightest amount, and when I mean slight, I mean 1 part to 10 to the 24th, 1 part to 10 to the 24th power, that slightest amount would cause this universe to be unstable and either grow and explode and be incapable of creating stars and galaxies, or implode and completely collapse. And those kinds of precise measurements and rules and laws, you can find example after example after example in this universe. It's the fine-tuned universe argument. Last point. Is there another slide, or is that it? That's it. Okay. So I want to make sure that you and I are aware that at the end of the day, it's not a question of who can prove macroevolution explains life, because that's a question of creation that macroevolution doesn't even attempt to explain. But secondly, it's an opportunity for you and me to have a discussion with them on what's more reasonable to believe, or is it reasonable to believe in macroevolution? And I think the answer is there's enough evidence that as Christians, it's rational, it's reasonable for you to reject the idea of macroevolution. You don't need it in order to explain this world, the reality in which we live, and it wouldn't help you explain this world without God. So I'm going to